Today's lesson is going to focus on the one or the whole for fractions. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at pattern blocks and counters, and we're going to determine the whole for each fraction that's given. So let's start by using pattern blocks. Let's say that this triangle here represents 1/2. I need to determine which pattern block would represent my whole if the triangle is half. So my whole would be one rhombus, because if I put this triangle on top of the rhombus, it equals half of that rhombus. Let's say we're using a trapezoid. And let's say this trapezoid represents 3/4 of my whole. So this trapezoid equals 3/4. I need to determine what my whole is. Well, if this represents 3 out of 4, then I can divide the shape into 3 parts. So I know that if this equals 3 out of 4 groups, all I would need to do is add one more triangle to that shape. And that is the equivalent of 2 rhombuses. So my whole would be 2 rhombuses. All right, next let's use a hexagon. Let's say that this hexagon represents 2/3 of my whole. If this hexagon represents 2 out of 3 groups, then all I would need to do is add one more trapezoid to this group. Now I have 3 trapezoids. So my whole here would be 3 trapezoids. All right, next let's use squares. Let's say that these 2 squares represent 1/3 of my whole. So this is 1 out of 3 groups. So I need to make 2 more groups that are exactly like my first group, because this is 1 out of 3 groups. So here's my second group. Here's my third group. If this is 1/3, one group out of 3 groups, then my whole would be 6 squares. Okay, let's do one more using the pattern blocks. This time, let's use our rhombuses again. Let's use 2 of these. Say I put this together. All right. If these 2 rhombuses represent 2/3 of my whole, then which shape represents the whole? Well, I divide this into 2 parts, and if I added one more part to that, one more rhombus, let's turn it this way, and I put it together, I know that my whole is a hexagon. All right, let's move on. Now let's find our whole using counters. So let's start with 3 counters. Okay, let's start here. Let's say that these 3 counters represent 1/3 of my whole. So what that means is this is 1 out of 3 groups, because we know that 3, or our denominator, represents the number of groups that we're going to have. So I know that this is 1 out of 3 groups, so I'm going to have 3 groups of 3. So what would the whole be in this case? The whole would be 9 counters. If 3 represents 1/3, then that's 1 out of 3 groups. Here are my 3 groups, and my whole is 9 counters. All right, let's do another problem. Let's say that these counters represent 2/5 of my whole. Well, remember, our denominator always represents the number of groups we have. So right now, we're showing 2 out of 5 groups. So I know in order to have 5 groups, I need to add 3 more groups to this. So if these counters right here represent 2/5, 2 out of 5 groups, what would our whole be? Let's go ahead and reveal. Our whole would be 10 counters. Here are my 5 groups of 2, and if I add up all my counters, I have 10 counters. All right, let's do another one together. Let's say that these 4 counters represent 2/3 of my whole. Actually, I'm going to get rid of this. There we go. All right, so these represent 2/3 of my whole. So this is 2 out of 3 groups. So I know that I need 1 more group of 2 to make my whole. So if I added 1 more group of 2 to this, my whole would be 6 counters. I have 3 groups of 2, and when I add all of those together, that equals 6 counters. All right, so you have 2 practice questions this evening. The first practice question is, if 2 counters, or 2 circles, represent 1/4, then what is the 1, or what is your whole? The second question is, if 10 counters are 2/5, then what is the 1, or what is your whole? So for the second question, I recommend drawing your groups with 5 groups, each group with 2 counters. Good luck.